Hi, everyone. We will get started in a few minutes. I'm going to grab some water, invite you to do the same. And yeah, just get settled and we'll give everyone a chance to log in. Cool. So as we're waiting for people to join, I understand there are questions coming in still about the media response, which is due today. And I am going to dedicate some time at the very beginning to do that, because I imagine that's kind of the forefront of everyone's mind. Yeah. Yeah, we're still getting people coming in, so we'll keep waiting. If anyone does have a question about the media assignment they want to make sure that I address, you can send me a message right now in the chat. But I will. We've got a little not extra time, but because we're not watching a film or a show today, we've got a little time to play with. So we can definitely sit with this for a bit. I'm gonna crack my window. It's very warm in Toronto. Actually, it's not. It's just really 7. Well, it's kind of warm. I went outside yesterday.
Hi, Professor. I have a question, actually.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so it's it's in regards to the previous class, the movie we watched. So I actually didn't have access to it because I didn't even understand how it goes. So are we supposed to create an account on Netflix just in case we don't have one already?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, so you will need. There's a couple of things we're watching that you will need a Netflix account for. So yes.
Okay, so each time we watch it, then we have to create the account. We don't watch it in class.
Correct. Yeah. Unfortunately, the Zoom doesn't let me screen share Netflix. There's a protection for copyright reasons. So you will need your own account. And then whenever we watch a movie together, it'll just be giving you the time to log into your own account and watch.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Okay. Okay, it looks like we kind of leveled off in terms of people joining for now. So I will talk slowly in case people come in. As you probably noticed by now, I don't talk slowly by design. I'm sorry, I do try and work on that, but I've been told that by people my whole life that I talk really fast. Okay, so happy Monday. Welcome to week 2. Can't believe it's week 2 because it feels like month 3 in a good way. Yeah, so I want to talk about, so today we were talking about intersectionality, and I will get to that. But there are a few things I wanted to touch on before we kind of get there. And I'm going to talk about the media reflection in great detail. And please keep giving me questions because I will look at them as I'm kind of going. Oh, that's a great one. Sorry. Sorry, I'm reading as I go, and sometimes I can't help myself. So first thing I wanted to talk about are the reading reflections that you've done. So if you submitted by today, I've graded them, so they should be up on Moodle. In general, I thought they were great. You all did really good work. The questions were really thoughtful. You covered a great range of different definitions, and the summaries were great. So I'm really happy. Thank you for the work you put into them. It's also just really good to know that everyone seems to be doing a really good job of just keeping up with the readings and grasping the material. I only will give feedback on the reading response if you ask for feedback, or I should have said this last week. So if you ask for feedback about a question, I'm happy to give it to you. Or if your definition or summary is like off base, like if I feel you're headed in the wrong direction or you're really not grasping the concept, then I will make sure to offer some advice on the correct reading of that. But if everything looks good, I won't offer any notes again. And the reason for that is I'm really not grading your question asking skills. I'm just grading on, are you keeping up and engaging with the material? So if you do all the things, you got 5 out of 5. Yeah, so again, really good work. A few really minor things. Make sure you put your name on the document, like when you have reading response week 2, put your name there. Moodle will track it either way, so it's not an issue of not knowing whose it is. It's just a really good habit to get into with all your writing. Make sure you always put your name on your work because you worked on it and it's yours. Make sure you are doing the summary as well as the definitions and key term. And that summary needs to be about one of the readings. So again, it's 2 discussion questions, 1 key term definition, and then take any of the readings from the week and just give me a little summary. 1 to 2 sentences is fine. A few people did like a paragraph, and that is fine, but that is not mandatory. I know sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's harder to be short. And so if it's easier for you to write more, you can, but you can get full marks with 1 or 2 sentences. So it's very much your choice. I also just wanted to make sure, again, no one lost marks for this, but a few people accredited Ursula K. Le Guin to be the author of one of the readings, because the lips reading, I believe, actually starts with a quote from Ursula K. Le Guin, and her name is at the top of the page. So Ursula K. Le Guin is a female science fiction novelist, and that's noteworthy because science fiction in particular is so dominated by men. And she has a great quote about kind of world building and feminism that starts off the chapter, but she's not the author of that chapter. So a few people said that they were summarizing the reading by Le Guin. We didn't do a reading by Le Guin. So just make sure you keep an eye out for that. Again, no one lost marks in this assignment, but if like on your term paper you were to like mix up a name or credit a name to the wrong person, like that might cost you some points. So just be really careful about that. Says when I hand it in, it says 2 key terms. Do I only want 1? Yes, it only has, I'm sorry, that might be a typo on when I enter it into Moodle. It's only 1. Some people did 2, and I thought maybe you were just being very eager. But sorry, I'm getting messages. If you want to do too, like if you want feedback or you just want to make sure you're getting all this stuff, you can add more. I'm also getting some messages about, oh, there is an issue with Moodle that I actually just discovered about half an hour ago because someone came to office hours where sometimes Moodle cuts off your second page unless I download it as a private file. So if you got a message saying I couldn't see or that you didn't do half the assignment, that you missed something, I will go back in and double check that. If you're still missing something, I'll email you. So if you got that message, don't worry about it for now. I will double check it later. And I'll make sure to check that issue with Moodle moving forward. So if anyone is missing a part of their assignment by the end of today and I truly can't find it, then I will email you. I hope that's cool. Thank you. And if you are having trouble seeing your grade, I'm going to ask you to just shoot me a really quick email, and I will kind of deal with that maybe on the break. But I want to kind of pivot into talking about the media response. So before I talk about the media response, I have a question. And it is a judgment-free question, and I'm going to ask, so I'll ask it first and then I'll explain it. Originally in the schedule, I said that today I was going to give you your prompts for the term paper because I wanted to give you as much time as possible to work on it. But the sense I'm getting, which is totally fine, is that people are still kind of actively working on their media response. And so maybe me going over the term paper today might be a little overwhelming, and you might just like be in media headspace and not really have time to engage. And so I'm thinking maybe I will just wait until tomorrow to talk about the term paper. It's only a day. But if people really want me to talk about the term paper today, I'm fine too. Can I get a show of hands who would like me to go over the term paper today? And just raise your hand. And I won't remember who did this, so there's no judgment. If you want me to talk about the term paper today. Okay, there are some hands. That's good to know. Okay, cool. So what I will do, I will talk about the term paper today. What I will say is that like you're just not, if you're like, I can only think about the media response until tomorrow morning, which is fine, by the way, then don't worry about it. Remember that it's in the recording. So what you can do is like, I'll talk about it last. You can like fully ignore me for now. And then tomorrow you can just look at the video and actually be like, okay, now I can listen and now I can take it in. Because you might want to look at it tomorrow morning. But I will go over the term paper more tomorrow. And I'm going to leave some time every class this week and probably early next week just to check in on different portions. So like today and tomorrow, I'm just going to kind of talk about what the paper is asking of you and how you should kind of approach getting started. And then later on in the week, I'll talk about things like citation and style and kind of more like technical writing things, rather than saying that all at once, which is just kind of like a big data dump. So yeah, we'll kind of scaffold the term paper as we go, but we'll at least, I'll put it on the table today. So if you want to get an early head start, that's an option. But again, if you are still working on your media response, I know that the schedule for this class is very intense, and yeah, don't feel bad if you're not gonna engage with that today. Okay. Next thing I want to talk about is the media responses, because you have questions and I get it. So I got a few questions kind of yesterday and this morning. So I want to kind of address them all, and then I'm going to start looking at the questions you've asked me in the chat, and then I'll open it up. So do make sure that you're engaging with one of the class readings. So you're picking a piece of media. Most people seem to be doing a TV show or a movie, which is fine, which is like, that's kind of what I expect, because that's what I would do. So make sure that you are referencing one of the readings from class last week. I figure most people are going to do the media response or the media reading, and that's fine. But if you're talking about feminist representation and you want to reference hooks, that works too. But you should be referencing some reading of the class. So if you just kind of do your own analysis and don't talk about any of the readings, that will cost you marks. don't try and cover everything. A few people have emailed me and said, I'm going to talk about this, 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 and this. Is that enough? I've never said to anyone, no, do more. Again, 500 words is not very long, and I'm aware of that. And that's kind of part of the challenge, is to focus and make decisions about what you can talk about. So don't worry that you are not, if you're talking about one particular character as a feminist trope, but there's a bunch of characters you're not talking about, that's fine. As long as you're kind of dealing with enough detail. But there's definitely going to be stuff you can't talk about, and that's totally expected. Speaking of length, I've gotten a few questions just now about the length. If you are a little over, that's okay. I'm going to say, it should be 500 words, and definitely feel like you don't feel like you have to write more than 500 words. But if you're over, as long as it's under 700, it's fine. So, if you go over 700, I'm going to put the note like, this should be edited down a bit, and make sure you stick within the requirements, because that is a part of writing, is like learning to write within difficult parameters. I think one of the most difficult things I've ever written myself was a grant application, and it could only be 2 pages. And I had to cover like a 5-year plan for my research project, everything I had ever done that was noteworthy, fun anecdotes about my own life. And the cutoff was so restrictive. And, just the whole process is just tweaking it down. And so much of writing is learning to do that. So I think this is part of the challenge, is to be brief and to be, to make decisions about what you cut. So, if you go, up to 700 and under, that's fine. Definitely don't go any lower than 500, just because that's such a short amount, that if you're doing less, I do wonder about what more you could have said. But, if you're at 502 words, don't think you have to add more because now I've raised it to 700. That's just a buffer. 500 is beautiful and perfect.
Can we write less than that?
Less than 500?
Yeah.
I wouldn't recommend it. Just because I think it would be extremely challenging to try and cover this in any depth in less than 500 words.
Okay.
Yeah. So now I'm going to read some stuff. Sorry. So someone's kind of asking, like, when I say it should reference the readings, like, yeah, it should reference the content of what are the readings. So like a sentence that says, like in the brand reading, the author talks about this trope, and we see that in this example I'm looking at. Yeah, so I mean, it can be a concept from a reading. It can be it can be a trope. It can be, you can look at kind of like the way feminists are being, if you're picking a piece of media that kind of demonizes feminism, and you might want to talk about the fact that this kind of makes me think of Hooks, because Hooks talks about the fact that like feminists are often portrayed in the media as X, Y, and Z. Yeah, so just show me. One of the things I'm looking for is, can you take concepts from the readings and then apply it to something we haven't looked at in class? So I am looking for your ability to kind of latch on to specifics from the readings, and then apply it to an analysis. You do not need to cite in this in terms of formal academic citations, so don't worry about that. If you want to and you want the practice, I'm happy to. You can cite, and I will give you notes on your citations. But you don't need to. Again, this is largely because 500 words is very, very short. You don't need to be doing full quotations for that, and also don't worry about citing, because we'll talk about that for the term paper. I'm gonna oh, that's a good question. If you choose to do like a works cited list and you make some errors, I won't deduct marks for that. I'll just kind of give you feedback, because it would just be practice, because that's like in excess of what that, or like it's additional to what I'm asking. Okay. Any other questions about the media reflection?
Can we get information from elsewhere apart from the readings?
You can, but it's not required. And I mean, they have to be academic sources is the thing. So I would kind of avoid that. So like just kind of websites are not great for academic sources. And I don't think, I don't recommend going and like doing research for this because it really is just supposed to be from one of the readings for last week. So, you know, if you have like an academic source on gender studies lying around that we haven't used, you can use it, but I would recommend not, just because it's going to take a time. Just make it, I think, easier on yourself if you can. Any other questions? The last thing I'll say is if you want just kind of a refresher on the general concept of the media reflection assignment, I did go over it on the first like 10 or so minutes of last Thursday's class on media. And so I would say like take a look at that, the beginning of that lecture, just because I do a little breakdown and expectations, and I kind of read out the actual assignment. Also check your syllabus in terms of, it's always a really good idea as you're writing to go back to the description of the assignment in the syllabus, just to make sure because sometimes like you read the assignment, I mean, you start working on it for a few days and that first reading gets a little fuzzy, memory is weird. So it's good to just kind of check back in and be like, okay, am I doing the thing that the assignment asks me to do? It's always a really good idea. Okay, great. So we're going to get started on intersectionality. The last thing I'll say, just to kind of advertise for the end of class, is so like at the end of this lecture, I am going to go over instructions for the term paper. Because you likely spent the weekend working on your assignment, and because we're not watching a movie today, I'm going to give you some time at the end of class for kind of like study hall. So if you need some time to kind of get ahead with the readings for this week, or if you want to use that time to work on your media reflection, you can use it for that. I know that the last few classes we've actually gone the full 3 hours because there were viewings. But this week we have 2 weeks with no viewings. And so for today and for Thursday, I'll do my best to give you a little class time to do, to kind of catch up with things. Because I know there's a lot, it's moving very fast. You're doing really well at staying on top of it from what I've seen. And yeah, we can kind of give you some time today. Okay, here we go. I am going to screen share. And then, okay, I'm gonna get really good at this by the end, I promise. Okay, cool. So today we're looking at intersectionality. Now this is a concept that's already come up a little last week, and it can be kind of tricky as a course instructor to know where to start something or when to bring it up. We really always, I mean, we should, and at least in some of the readings I've tried to look at, is feminism and gender issues should always be intersectional, but I also wanted to give intersectionality its own class because it becomes such a recurring theme. This week we are looking at issues of kind of social justice and gender. So we're looking at, tomorrow we're looking at colonialism and gender, and then we're looking at health and gender, and then we're looking at violence and gender. And we'll be looking at these from an intentionally intersectional place. And lots of last week, I hope you're kind of retro-realizing does speak to intersectionality and its importance. So we're always talking about it, but I still wanted to make space for it as its own course, or as its own class. So some key terms to look at today are intersectionality. single issue politics, exoticization, which is a hard word to say, polite racism, systemic racism, and anti-racism. So the first reading I'm going to talk about is the Crenshaw, Kimberly Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw is a really important name. And if you kind of continue in women gender studies or feminist studies, Crenshaw is a really important figure because Crenshaw actually coined the term intersectionality. She coined it in the year 1989. And this piece we're reading is actually a reflection a few decades later, kind of looking at why she coined the term and why it's still really relevant today. Crenshaw talks about a case that really inspired her to look at intersectionality and to find a word for this thing that she saw that wasn't being articulated in a lot of feminist discourses. So she uses an example of a case between a former employee and General Motors and looks at the discrimination of General Motors in terms of like hiring policies and jobs when it comes to race and gender. I'll also say this week we're going to talk about law a lot, and I understand law is its own kind of discourse. And so if you have, I will try and use as little legal jargon as possible and to keep this accessible. But if you have questions about like legal terms or anything, please let me know. Anyway, yeah. So this case with General Motors, the plaintiff is suing on the basis of discrimination. And looking at how job creation and job exclusion intersects with both race and gender. So she talks about the fact that, Crenshaw talks about the fact that in this case, General Motors has divided its labor along the lines of race and gender. So there are Black jobs, there are white jobs, there are women's jobs, and there are men's jobs, which is problematic in and of itself. But what the case points out is that the Black jobs are men only. The Black jobs, based on kind of racial stereotypes, tend to be about manual labor, tend to be unskilled, tend to be not office jobs, and tend to be associated with physical strength. Women's jobs tend to be kind of support and reception based. So again, not necessarily highly skilled, but definitely not manual labor based. Again, tend to be about support staff, about clerical work, about some data entry, some organization, but definitely like in a workplace environment offering support for like white executives. And the issue with that is that excludes Black women, obviously, because if a Black woman cannot do the men's job that are acceptable for Black men, and cannot do women's job that are acceptable for white women. So the way that this discrimination is intersecting is actually making it literally impossible for women of color to have a job. And the way the system is formatted, it kind of denies this idea that women of color actually exist. This is an issue that intersectionality tends to come up with a lot, that when very often people within the mainstream, when they think of minority groups, they will tend to think of them in terms of single issues. So there's like the women's movement, there is Black rights, there are gay rights, and this idea that everyone in that group is defined by that one thing. But of course, women's issues and Black issues are going to both intersect for women of color. There are also like Black gay women of color who are going to be a part of all of those groups. So the issue here is that while GM is technically both hiring Black workers and female workers, they're not hiring Black female workers. So they're not hiring that intersection. The case is actually dismissed, and this is kind of what spurs Crenshaw forward in thinking about this. And the logic of the court is that they're not discriminating against women, and they're not discriminating against people of color because they are hiring both those groups. So the court really doesn't acknowledge the existence of intersectionality, and says that the women's, basically have to pick a claim they're being discriminated against. They can't combine race and gender, which is in bonkers. And it is something someone who's never had to deal with race or sexism would probably say. So that is, that is literally the case study that spurs Crenshaw forward to create language around this phenomenon. Certainly, Crenshaw does not invent intersectionality, because intersectionality exists in the world as a phenomenon, but Crenshaw gives language to it and starts to draw our attention to it, and particularly draws our attention to the consequences of failing to see it. So illegal cases are a great example, because it says, well, like, here are the very real world consequences of not thinking intersectionally. It is actually leading to loss of jobs. It's impacting the economic stability of women of color and their access to labor, to have jobs, to have careers, and in different ways. So intersectionality, some ways to think about it and some definitions are that it highlights the multiple avenues through which racial and gender oppression are experienced. So again, we look at this in the last case, that oppression happens in multiple ways, and multiple ways that intersect them. So it's not that these women are being discriminated in two separate ways. They're being discriminated against in two ways that intersect, and that they feed on each other. So racist sexism is kind of more than the sum of its parts. It's potentially more disenfranchising than just sexism or just racism. It's a way of thinking about identity in relation to power, because intersectionality often is about who doesn't have access to power. The most visible people in a minority group will tend to kind of define that group, even when that group is made up of a fairly diverse people. So a way to think about this would be to looking at the prevalence of white feminism and the experience of white women as being the default assumption. If you Google women, you'll get pictures mostly of white women, because that assumption that when we say women, the default setting of womanhood is whiteness. And if you want pictures of Black women, you have to specify. So the invisibility of whiteness, or the naturalness of whiteness, and how that relates to power. Because a big part of intersectionality too is thinking of the way people are disenfranchised, not only from their most visible oppressors, but also the systems of support can undermine that. And then again, like I said, intersectionality addresses the erasure of marginalized subcultures. So the fact that the gay rights movement is largely dominated by white cis men, despite the fact that it's made up of people of all gender and races. The fact that poverty is not talked about a lot in LGBT movements, because the majority of people with the kind of power in those movements do tend to be white middle class. The erasure of trans women from feminist issues, because cis women do have more privilege and power within those systems. So fundamentally, intersectionality is about inclusion, and it's about building social movements themselves that are intersectional. So it's not about having separate 12 different forms of feminism. It's about building a feminism that understands that being a woman is one intersection of your identity. And the movement needs to reflect the fact that there are actually lots of different experiences. And Crenshaw talks about the fact that it's really important that, as with any kind of academic word or way of seeing things or discourse, is we can get really attached to just analyzing and criticizing. And that's, it's really fun to pick apart words and think. I like thinking, it's fun. Analyzing stuff is super fun. And it's productive because it can lead to stuff, but as an end goal, it's not enough. It needs to lead to tangible actions. So the analysis and pointing out when intersectionality is not being recognized is not the end goal. It's the beginning goal. It's generative, but it needs to lead to action. So another example of intersectionality that I think is a really recent and kind of distinct example, and when a lot of people that I kind of orbit in my world got kind of a front hand lesson in a front row lesson to intersectionality. So 5 years ago, almost 5 years ago to the day, there was the Pride Parade in Toronto. It happens every year. That particular year, Black Lives Matter was invited as a guest. Black Lives Matter had been doing a lot of active protest work with the Toronto police force, around like carding and undue harassment and violence. So Black Lives Matter was marching in the parade. They actually staged a protest in the middle of the parade. They did a sit-in at a major intersection and stopped the parade and had a list of demands for Toronto Pride. Toronto Pride had defunded a lot of Black-specific organizations that past year. There was also a general lack of representation of people of color on both the Pride Committee and generally around the programming. And there had been an increased kind of celebration of the police in Pride that for people who are marginalized and are still experiencing a lot of violence at the police felt very disingenuous and short-sighted. So one of the demands was that the police were no longer going to be marching in the parade, in uniform with police vehicles. So a central part of this was asking everyone to acknowledge that Black people constitute part of the gay community, and that to have a vision of Pride that was only based on the experience of white queers was a problem, because it denied the intersection of things like sexuality and race. And it also asked people, a lot of people used the word hijack to describe this. There was a lot of pushback and blowback and reaction from a lot of like cis middle-class white queers who wanted Pride to be just kind of like fun and like chill and like not too political and just like a party, which is not the history of Pride, which we'll get to next week. But using a word to say something like Black Lives Matter hijacked the parade, that assumes that Black queers don't have any rights or ownership over Pride. The idea that people of color are stealing Pride from white people assumes that Pride is owned by white people, which in itself reveals a major kind of maybe unconscious racism within the gay community. So one thing that this, I think this moment really also showed is it asked white gay people to reflect on the way their whiteness intersects with their queerness. So the fact that, yes, they are gay, and so there is a history of discrimination there, and there are ways in which all LGBT people are marginalized, but that also intersects with whiteness and affords a lot of privilege. Because the thing about intersectionality is that everyone has intersectional identities. Everyone has multiple ways of moving in the world and identity markers that affect who they are. So when we say intersectional identity, we're not just talking about like women of color. A white man has intersecting identities. A white man is male, is white, is maybe straight, is maybe middle class. So those are all different markers of intersectionality. So all identities are intersectional. And I think part of the protest of Black Lives Matter did a fair amount to kind of turn that mirror so that white gay people looked at the ways that they're actually quite privileged and the way that they're excluding a large percentage of their own community based on an unexamined experience of whiteness. We are going to talk more about Pride next week. So I bring it up now because I think it's a great example, but also stay tuned. So Audre Lorde, who is a prolific lesbian poet who, if anyone wants to, I'm not doing a lot of poetry in this class, I'm doing none, but if anyone wants some reading suggestions, Audre Lorde is a really great poet, feminist activist, and queer woman. And Audre Lorde has this great quote that I love. And she says, "There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not lead single issue lives." So in the documentary last week, we watched Feminists What Are We Thinking? There was one point where one of the women who had been in the protests in the 70s, who was a woman of color and who was talking about the fact that she actually wanted to talk about like sterilization, and that some of the other feminists, mostly who were white, kind of said like, no, we need to kind of stay on message and we can't be clouding the issue, and you need to just kind of like, we can only kind of do one thing at a time. So this idea that social movements need to be single issue is actually really antithetical to something like intersectionality, because we don't live single issue lives. People are affected by not only their gender, but by their race, but by their like their class, by their like physical ability. And And so very often when social movements become very mainstream and are trying to be as broadly accessible as possible, it becomes very common that they try to become single issue. So I'm just going to keep using gay examples. For really the last 20 years, up until quite recently, gay rights tended to organize around the issue of marriage. And a lot of gay politics were kind of seen as being a single issue, that it's like, if we can get marriage, everything will be fine, and kind of all efforts need to go into marriage. And that any kind of discussion of other issues, like the fact that like queer people of color are overrepresented in prisons, or the fact that like trans people experience violence disproportionately. There was this issue that talking about multiple things was going to kind of like just make the whole movement a little less powerful. And what Lord here is saying, and what intersectionality is saying, is that like a social movement has to be intersectional, and the idea of a single issue politics, it's a fiction and it's an omission. And it's an active choice to kind of erase other people's experiences. And usually in single issue politics, the people's experience who are getting front and center are the most privileged. So for example, focusing on gay marriage is dealing with something that's really important to like upper middle class gay people who don't experience poverty or violence or imprisonment. And it's often seen as being the most palatable, the most kind of like consumer friendly. Okay, so we're going to pivot to the next reading. So Morris talks about women's experience of racism. So I am going to go over just a few key terms in the kind of like nuance of racism. I'm also just going to clock my own positionality as a white gay man. I have not experienced racism. And so I do have the privilege of getting to learn about this as an adult. Most of my knowledge comes from this by reading the experience of people who have experienced it. So I'm really grateful for people who've done this labor. And it costs me way less to engage with it. Yeah, just take that in, and if you want to reflect on how this hits you, your positionality in this, that's always productive. So in terms of racism, the term racism does tend to get thrown around just in and of itself. Very often, if someone is accused of a more subtle form of racism, they will kind of say, I'm not a racist, that wasn't racist. And very often that refers to overt racism. So overt racism is racism that is extremely overt. So derogatory slang, violence, or exclusion based on race or ethnicity, expressing an opinion that is explicitly attacking another person or group based on race. That's an overt form of racism. And we have things like covert, subtle, or even polite racism. And so this can mean focusing on another person's otherness. There is, if anyone has watched the TV show Dear White People, the first episode, there's an opening sequence where the main character, Sam, there's just kind of a montage of her being othered. And so there are some examples of, she's got light skin, and so there's a montage of people meeting her and being, it's like, oh my God, where are you from? Or like, what are you? There's kind of a classic trope of someone who is not white being asked where they're from, and them saying like, I'm from Winnipeg. And then the second question being like, well, where are you really from? So the idea of focusing on a person of color's otherness, of them being an outsider, and this can be sometimes like exoticized or romanticized. So statements to a person of Asian descent that they must be really good at math, or that someone from like an Eastern country is inherently more spiritual. Again, so these are not necessarily designed to be derogatory necessarily, but still focus on race as a person of color's defining characteristic, and focus on that characteristic as outside of a Western experience. So the idea that a person of color in a Western culture is always an outsider, is always defined by their differentness, and that's their main defining quality. Then we have something like systemic or structural racism, which usually refers to a structure or process that has kind of been created in the world. A lot of this comes from colonialism, but certain practices that are maybe not even conscious among the people who are perpetuating them. So systemic racism might be, a hiring practice that simply benefits networking and access to privilege, and this tends to be something that's available to white people. So, for example, like if in like some fields, especially like business or law, graduating from certain universities, especially in the US, are give you better access to a career. And when those institutions, those universities have racially biased hiring or enrollment privileges, are very expensive, so tend to be less accessible to people who experience poverty, and white people tend to experience poverty on average less. This can also be policies and laws that target situations that are simply more common to people of color or create undue burden to people of color. I have another example now, it's just gone from my head. Taking a minute. It's gone, it'll come back. Yeah, so I mean, one thing that has come up a lot in kind of political discourse and activist discourse, especially in the last 10 years, that it's simply not enough to be not racist. That to truly dismantle racism, you have to be anti-racist. And so a lot of the times, again, when people are accused specifically of either systemic or covert or polite racism, the response is usually like, I'm not racist. And so not actively participating in a system is not the same as dismantling it, because the thing about a racist system is that whether or not a white person like myself is, I may not be saying overly racist things, but I'm still benefiting from a system that privileges my whiteness, and that privilege is based on the fact that there's not enough to go around for people of color. So it's not enough to kind of passively sit back and not be racist in order to actually affect change and to be coming a place from like a solution and action based. We have to be like anti-racist. So calling out issues of racism, actively working to dismantle, that's anti-racism. Whereas not racism is kind of like opting out and passively not engaging. One kind of utopian phrase from the 2000s that's become put under a lot of pressure, and I think this really speaks to passive versus active anti-racism, or anti-racism versus just not being racist, is the phrase, I don't see color. So I don't see color historically, refers to the practice of like not discriminating based on race, and then basically the idea that it's like, well, I don't even see a difference between people of color and white people, and I just think everyone's the same, which comes from an admittedly good benevolent place, and I think really also comes from what a lot of liberal white kids experience growing up, is being told that that race does not matter and that they should not judge people based on race, which is good. But that a way to action that and move through the world is to ignore race and to like literally not see color. The issue with that is that saying I don't see color and ignoring race, you also end up ignoring racism and systemic equality. It denies the fact that people of color do have different experiences and do face more barriers to access than to white people. It tends to minimalize the struggles to people of color because it can have a way of telling people of color that they can't express what's unique about their experience and position. It limits our ability to appreciate individual experience. You can't fix something you can't see. And so, I mean, living in a world in which racism is truly not an issue is a great thing to work towards. To kind of act like we're already there is actually a form of doing a form of disservice to anti-racist politics, and comes from a really privileged position. So, I mean, I still see this like memes of I don't see color every once in a while, and I've grown a little, and do try and educate people on that. So check the time. We're coming up on an hour. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to take a short break right now. And then when we come back, just because I don't want to speed through Morris too quickly. So we're going to take a really quick break. Maybe we'll take like a classic 7 minutes. And when we come back, we will jump back in and talk about issues of justice and housing. Okay? Cool. I will see you all in 7 minutes. So we're going to come back at 1:55. Hello, we're back. Everyone had a good break. Got some water, stretched a little. Okay, I'm going to jump back in and we are going to finish my lecture. We're going to finish the Morris and then we'll move on to some like group work and we'll go from there. Okay, sharing my screen again. Okay, so I mean, in a lot of ways, what Morris is outlining here, and this is kind of intentional, is we're looking at a lot of the different ways that gender and race and class intersect, and a lot of these issues are things that we're going to talk about actually throughout the week. So in a lot of ways, this is a bit of a preview. So you know, race and gender both impact the way, and racism and sexism both impact things like access to housing. So very often landlords or banks will perceive both people of color and women, and then certainly women of color, as being less reliable tenants. The assumption that people of color are going to be less respectable, are going to like damage property, or going to be potentially more criminally involved, and that women will have less access to financial stability, can impact the way people have access to housing, and certainly then becomes kind of like doubly an issue for women of color, particularly women of color who have children if they're single mothers. There's kind of a racist perception very often with people of color moving into neighborhoods, the concept of people taking over. There's a new series on Amazon, I think it's on Amazon or Crave, who remembers, called Them, which is about the kind of the phenomenon of people of color leaving the South in the 50s and moving to supposedly more liberal neighborhoods in the North, and you know, white people basically terrorizing their neighbors of color because of the threat of people of color taking over their neighborhoods. It's also a huge issue, kind of racism in Vancouver, and the idea of Asian immigrants being seen as kind of invaders. The concept of invaders is really interesting when it comes to kind of like geographic racism. Access to justice is also like a very large issue that can intersect race and gender. So assault on women of color, especially when they're perpetuated by white men, are more likely to be ignored or dismissed or minimized. There is both a racial and gender bias among most police officers, and certainly as an institution, policing has a lot of issues around race and gender biases. And then even if they are getting to kind of a higher court system, that the justice system does tend to discriminate against both people of color and women, and that there's simply less representation of allies in that. There are less women of color in a high-ranking police and justice official positions. So that also becomes an issue around access. There's a lot of stats in the Morris, and I'm not going to list too many here, but the fact that the Aboriginal female population is only 2% of the population of Canada, but makes up 20% of the female prison population, is to me a pretty good indicator of the way that the criminal justice system is skewed towards racism and sexism. So health, again, we're talking about this in 2 days. Health and sexism and racism are hugely intertwined. The medical field is incredibly dominated by men, particularly white men, and it's very much kind of coded within like a patriarchal identity. So white women are often seen as being more white people, but white women are seen as being kind of more compliant, whereas people of color, especially women of color, are often perceived as being too difficult. And this really, where men of color are often seen as being too aggressive. And this really affects a patient-doctor relationship. So much about getting access to healthcare is actually about communicating needs. A lot of diagnosis actually happens through a verbal exchange. And so when sexism and racism are impacting a doctor's way to kind of listen and hear what their patients are saying, that has a really specific impact on someone's access to healthcare. There is also the fact that, like, generally and across the board, women are perform more healthcare and healthcare taking labor, both in terms of representation in like formal professions that are based in kind of healthcare, nurses, hospice work, working in kind of a community settings, and also simply within their own families. There's a disproportionately high number of women doing healthcare labor. So when the system fails people of color, it then falls on female members of their families to pick up the slack. So women of color both have less access to healthcare and then are then called upon to work as free healthcare labor within their own communities. And this is just kind of like an endless cycle, because obviously if women have to work less or have less like energy to devote towards a career, because they're being called on to do unpaid health labor, that impacts their access to career and money. And it's just like, when we talk about like cycles of poverty, this is a big part about racial biases in terms of the medical institution. Medical textbooks and medical education very often use, pictures in textbooks are usually of white patients. So things like skin conditions, anything that has kind of a physical symptom is usually, doctors are trained to see it on a white body. So often literally will not know what it looks like on someone who does not have like a white anatomy. Gender specific testing is very common. So for example, women's heart attack symptoms are often described as just harder to recognize, largely because they're simply different in men and women, and most education around heart attacks is based around male symptoms of heart attacks, the perception that heart attack is something experienced by men. Clinical drug trials very often exclude women under the grounds that, if a woman is taking birth control or menopausal medication, that this is going to interfere with the test results, and that it's easier to test on men because the results are going to be more pure or less complicated, even if the medication is intended for use of both genders. So the side effects and interactions simply aren't tested. And that's like a huge bias of supposedly like objective scientific analysis. In terms of cultural representation, the way women of color, we talked about last week, the way women across the board are often sexualized in media. Women of color, particularly, this intersects with sexism and racism, because there are, even though there are still there's underrepresentation of women in the media, but if you then look at women of color, that number drops even further. And women of color do tend to be tokenized, tended to be cast and depicted to speak for their race, and speak for their race in a very sexualized way. And often what kind of like mainstream culture defines women of color by is by this like weird intersection of racism and sexism, so that like in different ways, but generally speaking, women of color tend to be coded as being more hypersexual, are usually depicted in terms of like a white male fantasy. And this translates pretty prolifically into the way women of color are on the receiving end of a lot of violence. So we'll talk about this more on Thursday, but the fact that women of color experience higher rates of violence and have a much harder time seeking like justice and police protection. A lot of that goes in with the cultural assumption that women of color are more highly sexual, are sexual objects, or simply tend to like invite more sexual attention, and therefore, the attackers are not criticized. People that assault them are not as criticized, because that's seen as kind of a natural part of racialized womanhood, is simply like being simply more sexual, which is of course not accurate. And also very much about a white Western gaze of otherness. So when we talked about otherness before the break, the concept that a lot of the way people of color, particularly women of color, are depicted in the media is not being done by the people being represented. So depictions of otherness and like exotic women is usually the result of like the fantasy or the imagination of a white director, writer, or artist. And historically speaking, even like within colonialism, the way that like nations and countries and cultures are depicted tends to be written by like outside voices, by white people reporting back, making an analysis based on their kind of own biases that are not examined. So a lot of the way women of color are stereotyped is kind of based on this long history of exoticization. And this is a slide of all the things I just said. So again, the fact that women of color are objectified in even greater numbers than white women, that racist stereotypes actually have like a very very tangible consequence, and they do make women of color more vulnerable to sexual harassment and assault. And that therefore, and then racism in the criminal justice system does block further access. Education obviously impacts all of this because, generally speaking, there is not a great history of educating public education when it comes to feminist issues, but then what little there is, and certainly kind of more independent studies, have historically tended to focus on with the women's movement and women's liberation as a white issue, versus civil rights education in the history of people of color tends to focus on men. So again, we have a problem of intersection. When we think of women's history, that kind of becomes white women's history. When we think of Black history, that tends to become Black male history. So Black women are left out of both those conversations. Racial biases exist within schools. Again, like schools and universities have historically been controlled by white cis men. Those are the people doing the training. Those are the people creating curriculum, who approve textbooks. And those biases happen on every level, from like the way curriculum is designed to interactions with students. Again, the perception that, what makes a good male student is a student who is very like ambitious and aggressive, where women do, especially young girls, tend to be rewarded for being passive, for being less ambitious. And so for being less prone to both trying to excel, but also for calling out injustice. That should say racism rewards subjects and educational opportunities. I will correct that. I'm sorry. No, racism towards subjects and educational opportunities. Yes, that makes sense. Citizenship and immigration, and particularly think of this in a Canadian context, the way Canada actually operates in terms of like who it allows to take in, and the different rules and regulations around people who do come to Canada, whether they're immigrating or seeking asylum. Access to money is a huge part of that, even though like women who are immigrating to Canada do tend to be doing so because of lack of access to resources and finances and independence in their countries of origin. And so that there is kind of a built-in system that perpetuates that, the way that sexism works. Women face disproportionate barriers to financial independence and education in general, so that kind of gets compounded. The kind of sponsored immigration program, which is really similar to indentured servitude, which was much more popular in the 1800s. Those people don't qualify for social programs, so have a much harder time kind of getting out of that cycle of poverty, which the immigration system perpetuates. Living caregivers, which some people do liken to a form of slavery. As the reading says, again, this tends to block individuals, people access to more information, because an employer kind of becomes a barrier to the person who's immigrated to the rest of the world. They're living in their house, they're controlling their income, they're controlling what their workload is. It's very easy for them to kind of manipulate the facts, for them to block access to information, for them to exploit them. Sexual harassment is rampant in domestic and live in domestic work situations, because again, you're in close quarters and you are relying on this person for your like access to stay in the country and for your employment. So it's really easy to take advantage of. And again, this is something that disproportionately affects women of color. Internalized racism, which is again, I'm going to flag as a white person, is something that I have not experienced, but growing up in a racist society, something we all do. I think part of the concept of needing to be anti-racist versus just not racist is the fact that like we grow up in a society that is saturated in racist concept, that is founded on racism, and so it's functionally impossible not to internalize some of that. And that we all have a certain amount of responsibility, agency to unlearn those things. for people of color, growing up in a race society does mean internalizing a lot of those messages. So like beauty campaigns and like kind of standardized things about the way physical beauty is depicted in the media tends to associate whiteness with beauty and blackness with being unattractive, with being ugly, with also being less professional. So very often, oh, this is an example I was going to say earlier. The idea that like speaking in any way, like any kind of accent or any kind of like a dialectic way of speaking is seen as less professional. So like learning to speak to sound like a white person, which was the subject of a movie really recently called Sorry to Bother You, aspiring to white ideals and white cultural tropes, avoiding, so, and a lot of people of color talk about the fact of like actually avoiding calling out racism or being seen as being too political, because that will kind of compound the amount of racism they've seen. There's a certain pressure to be like a well-behaved or model minority, seen as one of the good ones. And the awareness is not always very distinct in that. So again, if you grow up in a society that teaches you this on every level so aggressively, self-awareness of these things can be very hard to unpack and to raise consciousness. So very often these things are internalized and naturalized, and it can take a lot of work even to get to a place where we can think about them critically. And I understand that that's a big part of this class, is that some of these topics, particularly this week, but even last week, are going to ask us to think critically about things we may not have thought before, to question things we've lived with literally our whole lives in ways that can make us uncomfortable. And that's really productive and really important to interrogate and think critically about these topics. So the last thing, and this is kind of the last thing Morris touches on, is the idea of reverse racism. And this is something that white people will often talk about, the idea that they are discriminated against too, or that they have been treated badly by people of color. So the idea that people of color who might have had negative experience of white people are distrustful of white people, don't want to date white people, or just kind of have a reaction based on that experience. I think one really important thing about racism as a concept is that racism is as discrimination and power. And so there's a real difference between discrimination towards a person of color because of racist stereotypes that help the discriminator maintain power, versus a person of color dealing with a lifetime and a history of being marginalized, and therefore having issues with reconciling that with an oppressor. So in terms of reverse racism, I would say like, no, that's not a thing. And those are really different things. That's not a one-to-one. There's often a question of why are there no, I mean, there are white advocacy groups, they're called like white power and white nationalism groups. Or why are there no like men's rights movements? Where are the campaigns for white equality? The metaphor I often use is that's kind of like saying, why are there no homeless shelters for rich people? Because you don't need them, because we don't need them, because much like the way a homeless shelter is designed, not as kind of just a general equality thing, but as something that's really specifically targeting a problem, in this case, like poverty and lack of access to housing. And people who do not experience poverty and lack of access to housing don't need a social institution to help them with that. They already have it. So there aren't movements for men's rights because men's rights haven't been taken away and historically have been overrepresented. White people don't experience discrimination on the basis of their race. This is not to say that like white people don't experience other negative things. Like there are white people living in poverty, there are white people who immigrate and are disenfranchised by that system. But the thing about racism, the thing about white privilege is that it means that like the experience of being white is not compounding any of those things. There is a meme that goes around a lot that I appreciate and is, I think, takes a while for some people who experience a lot of privilege to unpack, is that when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And that's very true. That if you're not used to looking at this, and very often people who are in a position of privilege and power get very defensive about equal rights. And that's that's a productive thing for them to work through and something to think about and reflect. But to say that that's reverse racism is, I think, kind of missing the point of what racism is. And that is, I think, yeah, okay, that's term paper, not yet. Okay, so those are the readings for this week. Those are the general topics. I am going to, I'm mindful of the time because I did say that I was gonna let you go early. So I think for today, we will just, we're not gonna do the breakout rooms. But if anyone has a discussion question that you collected for today that you want to put in the chat, I would invite you to do that now. You can also raise your hand and ask me a question out loud. Okay, not seeing any questions. Quick show of hands. Who would like to? Would anyone like to do breakout rooms today? Oh, we have any questions? Maybe I was too fast. So someone's asking me if Canada systems have improved systems to judge academic equality for foreign university degrees. To my knowledge, not extensively. It's still a major problem, and people who are accredited with university degrees in other countries, especially kind of like specialized degrees, usually have to get recertified in some way. And even if there is like a recertification process that's kind of designed to bridge that gap, it usually is a kind of a pretty huge burden. So definitely not kind of recognizing. I know that this is an ongoing issue, and I'm not going to say that like nothing has been done, but it's still like it's a major point of inequality. And again, like the kind of tests and like recertification that someone with a degree from somewhere else, like a doctor, like someone who's like a licensed medical doctor or a lawyer or a university professor from somewhere else, the amount of work they have to do to kind of prove their legitimacy is kind of like comparable to doing additional schooling in university. So sometimes regulations discriminate by creating an undue burden. And so it's not necessarily a complete block, but it just makes it so hard to do that it discourages people from doing it. And it becomes like so close to discrimination that yeah. I will say about this particular lecture, I understand that these are like loaded topics that some people might not want to discuss this in a group. So if you have questions or thoughts, this is a great time to email me. The other thing is that almost everything we talked about today, we're going to go into more detail about this week. So if you need some time to kind of marinate on it, that's fine and probably good because we will have a chance. Yeah, I might open with discussion questions tomorrow just to give us a chance to reflect. So, like heads up, bring some discussion questions tomorrow. The last thing I will just kind of remind everyone about the week is that, so like, because we're dealing with violence, health issues, colonialism, is that some of the topics and images that come up this week are going to be potentially upsetting, might be triggering for some people based on your experience. Tomorrow we are talking about colonialism and violence among the colonial system. We are talking about gender and health. So we are going to be talking about birth control, abortion, the AIDS epidemic. And then on Thursday, we're talking about gender violence. So there are readings that do describe violence. And so just be aware going in that is there. And again, if you need to make certain selections about what you engage with, that's fine. And if you have questions, you can talk to me. We're watching 2 movies. So tomorrow we are watching Canada's Dark Secret, which is a documentary about the residential school system in Canada. This has some upsetting imagery. And then we're watching a great documentary on, they're both great documentaries. But we're watching Nothing Without Us, which is about women and the AIDS crisis and activism on Wednesday. And so again, there's some content there that that might be upsetting. So yeah, just kind of take care of yourselves, and thank you for engaging with this difficult stuff this week. And throughout the whole course, because I think it's productive. And I think even if you don't engage with literally everything we study, you can still get like a full rich experience out of this. So no pressure there, but if you can challenge yourself, that's always great. Okay, I'm gonna pivot now and talk about the final term paper, which I'm so excited about. Based on the reading responses, I'm really excited to read your stuff. I'm really excited to read your your media responses, and to get to your term paper. So without further ado, here comes the term paper. Boop, boop, ba-doo. And this is the point where if you just want to focus on the media thing for now, know that this recording is here and you can come back to this tomorrow, and that I will talk about this also tomorrow. So, but this is if you really just want a little sneak preview or you're ready to go. So your term paper is due next Thursday, May the 20th, which is the last day of class, incidentally, which is the latest. It's the most time I can give you. So the assignment is, I want you to take 2 or 3 readings from the class or one of the screenings, and write a paper that critically engages with and responds to one of these essay prompts. And remember, you should use these questions to craft a thesis, like a specific argument. And I'll talk more about that later in the week. So the questions I'm offering you that you can form an essay around are: what is the relationship between gender and power? How do instances of gender identity or gender regulation from the past affect the lives and rights of people in the 21st century? How does gender impact access to service, spaces, or rights? I missed a comma there. What is the relationship between gender and health? Imagine you're debating someone who has just said gender and race are completely separate phenomena. Write an essay that responds to and argues against that statement. And the last option, if you would like, you can come up with your own topic. However, you have to get my approval to do this option. If you're going to do this, you should do that soon. And you need to kind of contact me either by email or office hours to get the okay on option 6 by the end of this week. So again, you're going to pick one of these questions and you're going to write an essay that responds to them. And you're going to write an essay that takes kind of a critical stance to argue something based on these questions. And you're going to use 2 or 3 readings or screenings from the course to do your analysis. You should use you need to use readings from different weeks. So if you're going to do the health thing, you can't just pick the 2 readings from the health week. You have to bring in at least one other reading from another week. So you can't just do, I'm going to do the 3 readings from day 4. You have to cross-pollinate. You have to pick at least 2 readings from 2 different sections, because this is about you kind of forming an original argument rather than just summarizing the content. And we can talk more about that later in the week. I'm going to do a whole day, not a day, but I'm going to do a section on Wednesday on a thesis, and I'm going to talk about it a bit tomorrow. But we'll have we're going to play good thesis, bad thesis, which is a game I like to play. So that's the term paper. And that's what you're going to write. I hope it's pretty standard if you've written like a first or second year term paper before. You do not have to do outside research. I will not stop you as long as it's academic, but I am telling you it should not be necessary. You can do a great paper using just the readings from this course. I've designed this assignment so you don't have to do extra research. So I would strongly recommend you just use the course readings, because 2 weeks is not a ton of time. And it's slightly less than 2 weeks. The last thing I'm going to say, and I will talk about this in more detail, is this is my approach to writing a term paper. And actually, this is the approach I use to all my writing. So when I write full-length articles to be published, I use a really similar system. And I like to break it down because I think a lot of people, especially kind of in a new writing experience, kind of consider writing to be a two-step process. Step one, you sit down and you write the thing. And then step two, you spell check it. And then you hand it in. That puts so much pressure on the writing process, and it doesn't give you a lot of breathing room to really think about your ideas, and it's very stressful. So let's not do that. Let's do this. So this is a 6-step process, and that's maybe a lot of steps, but I think it works really well. So step one is what you're going to do in the next day or two. Once you start looking at this, you're just going to brainstorm, read over the assignment, go over your notes from class, think, come up with an idea. Here's what I think my paper is going to be. Let that be its own step. Don't rush that. Then you're going to do research, but you're not actually doing research. Your research is your notes. So you're going to go over your reading notes. You're going to reread articles that you think you might write about. You're going to look at your notes. You're going to take new notes if you need to, collect some citations, and then think about how that works with your original idea. Does your original idea for the paper still work? Do you need to tweak it a little because you found a detail that like slightly contradicts it, but is like really productive? Then do an outline, point form, jot some ideas down, see how it looks on the page. This is also a great place to start like picking out, okay, here are some citations I'll use to back up my ideas and my arguments. Step 4, now you write a rough draft. Don't start with this. This is step 4. This is a chance for you to kind of take all the planning you've done and see what it looks like as an essay. You basically fill in the blueprint and try and write something roughly the length of your paper. This is a point to get all your ideas out on the page. Try not to edit as you go. If you can just treat this like I'm just going to get on the page and I will deal with it later, editing as you go really slows you down, and it can actually stop you from generating good ideas. This is the really creative part of it. And you might be surprised. You might write something you didn't realize you thought, or an idea you didn't know you had until it got on the page. Step 5 is the revision draft. Now that you've written the thing, now you can start thinking about it. So read through it like this, because I hate reading my own writing. It's going to be very hard. Does it make sense? Okay. Does it work? Do you like it? Do all your points support the thesis? Is everything on the page necessary? Does it all connect back to that main thesis? Maybe you ended up saying something slightly different, but you like it. That happens all the time. So you might want to just update your thesis. That's fine. Does the organization work? Sometimes we write things in a certain order because it makes sense for us as the writer, but it's not necessarily the best order to explain things in for a reader. So that's a point where you can be like, okay, now it's on the page. I actually think paragraph 3 needs to be paragraph 2. Reread the assignment. Again, it's been a while since you read that assignment. You've done so much work since then. You might have gotten kind of far away. Just make sure you're still doing the thing that was assigned. And then step 6, now that you have done all of the creative stuff, your ideas are solid, your thesis works, you're happy. Now you can do things like checking for grammar, spelling, style, all the technical stuff. Do that at the end because that can actually, I think, for me, really get in the way of being critical and creative, and will slow you down. And also at the step 6 point, you're not going to add anything new probably. So the editing and the drafting you do at this point is the last step. You're polishing it. So that's how I approach a paper. I mean, some of these steps will only take you a day. So you can totally do this over the next week and a half. And this is just a way to approach this, to kind of break it down, that I think makes it a lot easier to craft an essay. I can stop sharing. I will come back. I see there are questions. Okay, I did have a question. Yep. Are there any questions about the term paper for now, knowing that I will totally cover this tomorrow and it's very early? Okay. Are there any questions about the media review that is due by the end of today?
If we don't have a link for for instance, I'm using an Instagram post. If I don't have the link for it, can I just send a picture, or I don't know?
Great question. Yes, absolutely. If you can send a picture with it too, that's amazing. Also, if you don't have a link for the thing you're talking about, like if it's a movie and you don't have a link to the movie, that's fine. It's like if you can, it helps me a little because I can get a little context. But if you don't have one, like don't stress about it.
Okay, thanks.
Welcome. Someone asked, can I add an image rather than a link to the image for the media review? Absolutely. If you just want to like copy and paste an image into the into your like Word document, that's fine too. It's just for me to get a reference to what you're analyzing, and it just makes it easier for me to understand. Okay, so I think we will end it there. So you have an hour and a half to work on your reading responses, or your media responses rather, and catch up on some readings for this week. If you have any questions about about anything, email me. Otherwise, I will see you tomorrow. And tomorrow we are looking at colonialism and race. Okay, I'll see you tomorrow. Hello?
Sorry, too tired, you gotta go to bed.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm kind of confused on like the media response
Okay.
on what to do. I understand what we're meant to do.
Sorry?
I said I don't understand what we're meant to do for the media response.
Okay, so you should pick any piece of media, like a TV show, a movie, and you're gonna write 500 words just analyzing it in a way really similar to the way we analyzed Modern Family on Thursday. And
Modern Family.
Yeah.
Oh, the show on Netflix.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh.
So yeah, use our discussion last week as an example, but you're writing 500 words just analyzing any TV show or movie.
I just like talk about like what the show is talking about.
Sorry?
I'm just meant to talk about like what the show, like about the show.
Yeah, talk about a show or movie that you watch, and talk about its gender representation, and tie it to one of the readings from last week.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right.
Bye.